The UK has led the way out of lockdown, arguably. Parts of China now find themselves stuck behind the locked doors again due to the Chinese Communist Party's response to COVID-19. Shanghai, the busiest port in the world, has shut down, and containers are beginning to pile up. Interestingly, there's been rare signs of public protest, and panic buying has been seen taking place. Well, joining me to discuss what these signs of unrest mean for China and the impact of the closure of Shanghai, that impact that it'll have on global supply chains even. The director of the University of Oxford's China Centre, Professor Rana Mitter, is here. Welcome to the programme. I suppose it is extraordinary to so many of us, where COVID seems like something that is receding into the past. The fact that the people of China are being plunged back into lockdown, indefinite lockdowns as they're being described in some cases. How does China end up in this situation?
Well, Tom, you're right that this is being noticed actually in China itself. One of the memes that's going around on social media is that the current year is not 2022, but in a pun between Chinese and English, they say it's 2020, TOO. In other words, back to 2020 when the world was in lockdown. But the answer is really that the Chinese Communist Party took a decision very early on in the pandemic in February, March of 2020, that they would go for what they call a zero COVID policy. In other words, that no case of COVID could be allowed to basically spread or in any way grow in the wider population. People had to be sent to hospital, isolated, and essentially shut down. And for about a year or so, in some ways, it worked very well. Even though statistics are clearly, how can one put it, put together in a way that's approved by the state, it is clear when one talks to friends in China that the death rate has been very, very low compared to many other countries. But the problem is that the exit strategy is now very unclear. It appears to be basically mostly now about doubling and tripling down on the existing strategy, and social media in China shows that people are getting increasingly concerned that it may never end.
It's extraordinary to see some video out of Shanghai where people seem to have broken out of locked down homes to protest on the streets. Only a small number, I should say, but it's extraordinary that people would have the courage to do so in such a society. Given that zero COVID seems to be very, very hard to push ahead with in the context of Omicron and super spreadable subvariants of it, has China made a misstep here, and is it potentially fostering some really quite significant dissent?
Well, actually, it's worth noting that the nature of dissent in China is not quite as simple as you put it, Tom, although I know where you're coming from on that. One of the things that we've seen over the years, both in terms of protests on the street and in social media, is that the top-level authorities have generally pushed the blame towards lower-level authorities. So those protests are mostly about local politicians in Shanghai at a kind of provincial level who are now being openly blamed. And in fact, the centre, the Beijing government, is blaming them too. So it's more of a strategy of saying, actually, it was, the government's got it right. The local officials, the ones who have got it wrong in that particular case. If you look at social media, there's also been a long trend in China on lots of subjects, sexist workplaces or, crackdowns on environmental issues, where basically a certain amount of dissent is actually permitted on Weibo, the China's equivalent to Twitter, you might say, partly because it helps the authorities both say that they do allow a certain amount of freedom of speech and also for them to monitor what people are concerned about. But let's be really clear, that only goes up to certain limits. And in this case, I suspect that there is going to be a lot more censorship of people on social media basically complaining about being locked down, about their pets being killed. This is something that's going wild on Chinese social media. Dogs are basic pets are being slaughtered by the health officials on the grounds that they might be carrying COVID. That, and we know we're in Britain, we're in a dog-loving country too, that's making a lot of people very, very angry indeed in China.
I can imagine that. I remember seeing a report of some hamsters being killed in Hong Kong.
That was Hong Kong, yes.
To stop the spread, which is really quite remarkable and bizarre. But it is extraordinary that the Chinese Communist Party seems to be seeking to wash their hands of decisions that the Chinese Communist Party has made by pushing it down to lower levels. I haven't quite heard that put in that way before. Are they successful in that attempt to blame others?
Well, Well, here's the end game. And I have to say, Tom, naming no names, but some governments around the world do sometimes push the blame for what politicians do onto officials. It's not unknown even outside China, but let's not go down that route. Here's the end game, I think, from the Chinese Communist Party point of view. Number one, there's going to be almost certainly no change in the policy this calendar year. The reason being that Xi Jinping, president of China, general secretary of the Communist Party, is looking for an unprecedented third term in power. Normally, you only get two, and that won't be put into place until probably October at the Chinese Party Congress. So expect relatively little change till then. Then I think the strategy actually is to go, double, triple, quadruple on new vaccines. China has not had mRNA vaccines, ones like Pfizer and Moderna, which and the kind of vaccines it does have are not as good as AstraZeneca, which is the Western equivalent of the other sort of vaccine. But a lot of money, a lot of investment is being put in China's labs to basically get vaccines out. I think 23 are in production, from what I've gathered at the moment. That may be essentially the turning point. Turn China a little bit like the UK into a country that has very wide jabs at all levels, and that may finally be the moment at which the tide turns. But I would expect that if this carries on as it is, we're talking months, not weeks.
Remarkable that they've come to this realisation a little bit too late. A really fascinating issue, and no doubt one that we'll continue to follow with interest. But for now, thank you so much for joining us, Professor Rana Mitter, Director of the University of Oxford's China Centre. Now, Russia